Welcome to the conversation, and the conversation in the country, unfortunately, has been hijacked by the right wing, as it often is. Talk about something called critical race theory and how apparently all of our schools, it's an epidemic in Oklahoma, apparently, are being taught this theory. And part of this dangerous theory is that that black folks might have been discriminated against in this country at some point. No, do not teach that in the schools. That can't be true. They say with a straight face. All right, we're gonna bring on an expert here to talk about it. Eric Ward is the executive director of the Western States and senior fellow with the Southern Poverty Law Center. Eric, welcome.
Such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, no problem. So Eric, just real quick, what is critical race theory and are high schools all across the country actually teaching it?
It's not being taught in high school. It's barely being taught in law schools around the country. Critical race theory is academic discourse that largely takes place within the legal educational system in our country. It is legal scholars who are basically arguing that slavery and the legacy of slavery and the systemic racism that derives from that historic system still has an impact on law, and that simply those involved in the legal process need to be aware of that and to take that into account when making legal decisions. Not very radical, but we have to understand that the Republican Party is desperate in this moment, desperate to hold together its base and desperate to try to build some type of opposition as it leads into the midterm elections. That's really what critical race theory is. It's a QAnon version 3.0.
Yeah, their attacks against it are that certainly. So, but they have been taking action in Oklahoma on the 100th anniversary, or very close to the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, where successful African American business people were murdered by a white mob. They decided to pass a law saying you can't teach about racism in America. A curious way to celebrate that landmark. And so now the Republicans say, no, we're not saying you can't teach racism. We just don't want you to talk about it. I know, but like, Eric, help me out. What are these bills saying? I mean, what according to these bills, what can we teach and not teach?
Yeah, according to these bills, one cannot teach critical race theory, or as the far right has framed it, one cannot teach that racism in America is an original sin. But let's be clear, this is part of a national campaign, right? I think about Christopher Rufo, who is a leading figure at the Manhattan Institute, who has been pushing this campaign since September, has spoken to other think tanks such as the Heritage Foundation and others. And in his take on public social media was simply that the purpose of attacking critical race theory was to grab the brand and then to use it as an umbrella term for any conversation on race equity in America. In short, the attack on critical race theory is an attempt to chill the national dialogue on racial equity that has been created by the Black Lives Matters protest over the last years. There has been legislation that has been passed around the country at local and national levels, but the language of the bills are less important than the goal of the legislation, which is to tell people that having discussions on systemic racism or racial discrimination is wrong. It flies in the face of nearly everyone across the political spectrum. But as I said before, it's a conspiracy. And the goal of the conspiracy, right, is to try to divide the American public, to use critical race theory, right, a very narrow discourse on race equity as a way of attempting to defund public education, right, to continue to try to other progressive and liberal forces in the United States.
So that's why we bring on experts, because you stated that in a very sophisticated way and explained the origins of it. I would explain it in a simpler way. It's dog whistles. We've had it before,
yes.
And so it was states' rights, which wasn't really about the right of a state to pass pro-marijuana laws. States' rights was a euphemism for let us discriminate against black people in the South. And then it was talk of welfare queens, and they didn't mean the bankers that took trillions of dollars from the Federal Reserve and the Treasury. They meant black folks, as always, right? Then Donald Trump put away the dog whistle and he came out with a human whistle. It just started attacking minorities of all sorts. And this is somewhere between a human and a dog whistle. And to your point, Eric, it's Oklahoma always goes first, which is kind of hilarious because none of this is happening in Oklahoma, which actually proves your point perfectly. They were also one of the first states to pass anti-Sharia laws, as if they were about to get taken over by the Islamic Caliphate, right? So when you see that, you see that this is more not addressing an imminent threat, even if they thought it was a threat, right? But more about the propaganda that they want to put out there.
That's exactly right. I mean, what you describe is what we're seeing is just another version of the big lie. And we've seen it with QAnon. We've seen it around COVID-19. We saw it with the othering and the dehumanization of refugees and Muslims. And we saw it used against immigrant kids. You almost want to roll your eyes and to laugh it off as just another strange conspiracy by those seeking to attack democracy and the idea of an inclusive America. But in truth, we also have to understand and take this seriously, because most of these big lies have led to very real physical attacks in this country. If we're talking about COVID, if we remember in the early days of the right-wing noise machine and its use and misuse around COVID, it led to an attempted bombing of a Jewish hospital in Kansas City and the attempted bombing of elder care home in Massachusetts. We saw this around the attacks on immigrants and refugees. It led to the attempted bombing of a Jewish philanthropist by the name of George Soros and an attack on a Jewish synagogue at the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh. We should understand that this rhetoric and irresponsible behavior by elected officials always leads to an expression of violence. And that's why the rest of us have to use our voices to speak out right now and to demand that elected officials step away from what is merely a conspiracy theory. There is no threat around critical race theory. The only threat, right, are the continual attacks by right-wing extremists who have used violence to attack police officers, to attack marginalized communities, and to attack our government institutions. That's where the real threat is. This is a distraction, but one we need to pay attention to.
So Eric, their followers don't even know what critical race theory is. That's why I asked you what it was in the beginning. They have no idea. What they interpret that to mean is, are we going to talk about how we discriminate against black folks? We don't want that in our history books. But wait a minute, Eric, aren't these the same folks saying we shouldn't take down the statues of the Confederate generals because we don't want to erase history? And here they are, literally trying to erase history.
Yes, I mean, what we are seeing is misinformation and disinformation that seeks to undercut one of the critical components of a society, which is historical memory. What we are seeing is that those who are attacking critical race theory, in order to use it as an umbrella, right? The goal is to manipulate us into believing that every uncomfortable conversation around race in America is somehow this idea of critical race theory. We should understand, though, that this is a double standard by these authoritarians, by those opposed to democracy. In one hand, they are holding up the First Amendment, but in reality, they're crushing it behind their backs. This is similar to what we saw after Brown versus the Board of Education in the 1950s. Following the end of legal segregation by court order in the United States, what we saw was the birth of something called the Citizens Councils, also known as the White Citizens Councils. This was a light version of the Klan, right, that sought to use the power of politics and policy in order to chill the civil rights advocacy that was happening in the country. This is a similar attempt to chill the conversation on race equity, one that the majority of Americans want in this country. Look, let's be clear. More white Americans today, not just by whole number, but by percentage, are more supportive of Black Lives Matters in this country, right, than were ever supportive of Martin Luther King Jr. in his lifetime. The truth is, is the majority of us want to have a conversation around race and racism so that we can move the country forward together. This is just an attempt to undermine that progress, and it's an attempt to distract. So we can't be gullible in this moment. We have to know better. And we have to understand that looking at a few exaggerations that happen around race equity are not a reason to end the conversation on race equity. It is a purpose for us to get stronger in that conversation. And attacks on critical race theory simply don't allow that to happen.
Yeah, I just saw a scary piece of the future. I mean, the right wing now is so radical that as you were talking about the Klan and how they tried to soften it with the White Citizens Council, which wasn't softening it very much at all, I thought, oh my God, I think they're gonna come back and try to rebrand the Klan because they're rewriting all of history. I mean, if you go online, they will rewrite anything now. It's wall-to-wall propaganda. And so wait for it, unfortunately. And by the way, there's a real problem in this country. 60% of conservatives said that it's a bigger problem to see where discrimination does, to see discrimination where they think it doesn't exist than racism itself. And so we are a very divided country, and we can't even see and hear and understand one another, and it's going to take a while to resolve. But Eric, thank you for fighting for what you do, and thank you for coming on here and trying to shed some light on the reality.
Such a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks for watching the Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.